So, in the most famous poem ever written about hell, the Inferno by Dante Alighieri, we find out that the usurers, people who lend money for interest, are put in the same circle of hell as the sodomites. Now, we might wonder why. They're not the only two types of sinners in that circle of hell, but why would those go together? I mean, they're very different types of activity, after all, so why would the usurers and the sodomites be in the same level of hell? And the answer is quite interesting. It turns out that Dante was himself, philosophically speaking, an Aristotelian. He loved the philosophy of Aristotle. And this particular circle of hell, the seventh circle for the violent, is reserved for violations of nature. So the way that usury and sodomy are supposed to be similar, according to Dante, is by way of violating a certain purpose. If you read the first book of Aristotle's Politics, you discover that Aristotle thought money had a purpose, or a telos. Money is supposed to be used for certain things, and if you don't use money for those things, but for some other thing, then you're misusing money in some sense. Now, fast forward past the medieval period when a number of Christian mores about love and sexuality were picked up, and you find Dante, an Aristotelian, who sees that the usurers and the sodomites are both taking something and using it against its natural purpose, right? Now, this is a way to introduce Aristotle, is to let you know that when you read Aristotle, you're in a certain kind of philosophical setting. You're in a setting where there are violations of nature, or at least where that's seen as an ethically bad thing. It's an area of philosophy, or a type of philosophy, where there's a preoccupation with what's natural and an equation between what's natural and what's good. Now, we don't necessarily have that sort of a conception today, perhaps thankfully, but we are going to look at Aristotle through that lens because that is the way in which he designed his philosophy. So, here's some study guide questions to get us started on Chapter 5 and Chapter 7 of the first book of Nicomachean Ethics. 1. Which kind of end, according to Aristotle, is the best and most complete? 2. Why does Aristotle take happiness, or eudaimonia, to be this end? 3. How, according to Aristotle, do people form their ideas about happiness? 4. Why, according to Aristotle, is pleasure not the same as happiness? 5. Why, according to Aristotle, is honor not the same as happiness? 6. Why, according to Aristotle, is virtue not the same as happiness? 7. Why, according to Aristotle, is wealth not the same as happiness? 8. Why does Aristotle turn to types of biology after asking what the human function could be? 9. Why, according to Aristotle, is happiness not the same as the life of nutrition and growth? 10. Why, according to Aristotle, is happiness not the same as the life of sense perception? 11. Which two parts of the soul, according to Aristotle, have reason? 12. How are the parts of the soul arranged, according to Aristotle? 13. What, according to Aristotle, then, must happiness, or eudaimonia, the human purpose, be? Alright. As always, you'll want to write the answers to these questions down as they appear in the lecture, and that way you'll be able to better internalize the lesson using these questions as markers. Aristotle says that an end is complete when it is pursued for its own sake, or in its own right, and that an end is most complete if it's pursued only for its own sake and not for any other sake. What does this mean? Well, an end is a goal. It's a thing that you're trying to get to or trying to achieve. Sometimes you set goals in order to achieve other goals. For instance, I might have the goal of running down the stairs right now in order to achieve a second goal of buying ice cream from an ice cream truck once I'm down there. Other sorts of goals I might have for no reason other than I want to achieve them. For instance, eating the ice cream. It's not that the ice cream gets me anything else, it's just I like the ice cream. That's the end in itself. Aristotle thought that every sort of practice, every sort of craft, every sort of science, and every sort of activity, every sort of action you might engage in, are set up in a lattice-like network in which some things you do because they help you get other things, and then other things you just enjoy all on their own, just because they're enjoyable all on their own. Think of the good of running to get ice cream in time versus the good of actually having the ice cream. One of those goods helps you get something, the other one is just good on its own. Aristotle thought that in life, everything that we pursue is hooked up in this way, so that we wake up and we drink the coffee. Why do we drink the coffee? In order to go about our day. Why do we go about our day? Well, in order to get this bread. Why do we get this bread? And so on and so on. Aristotle thought that if you were to continually ask why is a person pursuing this, and then why are they pursuing that, and you were to ask it repeatedly enough, if the person you were talking to was honest and knowledgeable, then you would eventually end at the answer of, because I want to be happy. Or, for Aristotle, because I want eudaimonia. Now, here we should pause and note that eudaimonia, or good-spiritedness, is not always best translated as happiness. Eudaimonia is a pleasant state that includes a pleasant affect or a pleasant feeling like happiness, but for Aristotle it's something much more than just a feeling. It's not the utilitarian's notion of happiness, where, ta-da, I have a smile so I'm happy. Aristotle's notion of happiness included a whole way of living or thriving or doing well in action, doing well in your environs, doing well in your life. Something that not only feels good, but includes, doing things correctly and properly functioning. Aristotle thought that there is such a thing as that. There is such a thing as a best flourishing state to be in, is called eudaimonia, it's translated as happiness, and Aristotle says it's the one thing that all of us pursue for no other reason than itself. At the end of the day, no matter what kind of a person you are ultimately attempting to pursue eudaimonia. And that's why Aristotle takes it to be the best and most complete end, it is the final answer to why we do anything. And on top of that, we don't pursue it for the sake of anything else. We only pursue it for its own sake. And it seems to occupy a supreme position in the explanatory network of why we pursue anything at all. All this, of course, is around line 30 in the 7th chapter of the first book of Nicomachean Ethics. We say that an end pursued in its own right is more complete than an end pursued because of something else, and that an end that is never choice-worthy because of something else is more complete than ends that are choice-worthy both in their own right and because of this end. Hence, an end that is always choice-worthy in its own right, never because of something else, is complete without qualification. Now, happiness, more than anything else, seems complete without qualification, for we always choose it because of itself, never because of something else. Honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue we certainly choose because of themselves, since we would choose each of them even if it had no further result, but we also choose them for the sake of happiness, supposing that through them we shall be happy. Happiness, by contrast, no one ever chooses for their sake or for the sake of anything else at all. In addition to noting that happiness is the most complete goal, he also notes that it is the most self-sufficient goal. That is, if you have happiness, there's a sense in which you don't really need anything else, except for whatever you might need in order to be happy. But once you've got that, there's no further thing that you should need or want. So in that sense, it's complete, it's self-sufficient, it's the thing that we all aim at. That's happiness. Now let's go back to chapter 5 of the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics and talk about what people think happiness is. Aristotle tells us that people get their idea about what happiness is, what it is to lead a good life, from how they live. Depending on how they live, they will form a certain conception of what the ideal state would be. And Aristotle thinks that there are roughly 3 sorts of lives that people can lead. There's what he calls the life of gratification, there's the life of political activity, and then there's the life of study. Aristotle quickly dismisses the identification of pleasure with happiness. He notes that pleasure alone is a good that even grazing animals can achieve. And as we'll see, Aristotle thinks that if our purpose were no more than the purpose of grazing animals, if that was all our happiness required, then it would render mysterious so many of our other capacities. If all we were meant to do is sit around and feel pleasure, then why do we have this ability to communicate complex ideas to each other? Why do we have this attraction to knowing complex ideas? Why do we want to make sense of things? Why do we ask why, for instance? That would all be just extra inexplicable stuff if indeed our natural purpose were just to experience pleasure. Or so argues Aristotle. The political life, the life of public speaking and exchanging ideas and deciding what should be done, that sort of life tends to produce an idea of happiness that involves being loved or being honored or being popular in some way. Aristotle dismisses the idea that happiness is honor or popularity because honor and popularity are things, first of all, that depend on other people, right? In order to be honored or popular, you need to be honored by someone or popular with someone. And related to that now, there's the question of who you would want to be honored by or who you would want to be popular with. It's not good to want to be popular among foolish, vicious people. You want to be popular among the right kinds of people. What kinds of people? What sort of trait would make someone excellent as an admirer? Well, whatever that trait is, that will probably be much more important than just being popular. And that brings Aristotle to the next candidate for happiness, which is virtue. Now remember, according to both Plato and Aristotle, virtue is a feature that helps something perform its proper function well. A trait that allows something to act correctly and act well given its purpose. Now, the problem with saying that happiness is virtue is that we should distinguish between just having a virtue and exercising that virtue. Because, as Aristotle points out, you can have a virtue and spend most of your life asleep. I mean, imagine somebody was asleep for most of their life, but they lived just enough to become virtuous before they fell asleep. So let's say that they lived a little, they became courageous, and they became sympathetic, and they became magnanimous. They lived a little to become virtuous, they became honest, and then they just slept. Would they be achieving life's purpose as they slept? They would have virtue. If you think, no, that's not what life is about, you can't achieve life's purpose, you can't truly be happy or have a happy life if you spend it all asleep, well, that tells us that happiness cannot just be having virtue. Happiness would have to be something else, like the exercise of virtue. And that takes us up to chapter 7 again. To exercise a virtue, or to activate a virtue, is to perform a proper function. Sharpness is a virtue of knives. Sharpness helps knives perform their proper function well. Sharpness is a trait that allows them to function correctly. So sharpness is a virtue of knives. And if we were to activate a knife's sharpness, if we were to take a knife and make its sharpness active, that would mean that we would be using the knife. The knife would be performing its proper function. By cutting with the knife, we would activate its sharpness. And likewise with all the other virtues. If having a virtue isn't enough to achieve happiness, then perhaps activating a virtue is. And so, if human happiness consists in activating certain virtues, that would mean that human happiness consists in performing some kind of proper function, some kind of human function. And it's here that Aristotle asks, well, do human beings have a function? Then do the carpenter and the leather worker have their functions and actions, but has a human being no function? Is he by nature idle without any function? Or just as eye, hand, foot, and in general every bodily part apparently has its function, may we likewise ascribe to a human being some function apart from all of these? Now, Aristotle had a very specific way of looking at living creatures. He thought that every living creature has a certain mode of life, a certain way of living and thriving, which is perfect for it. A certain niche, if you will. And he wants to know what the human niche is. What's the human mode of life that's distinctively characteristic of it? what is the human ergon, or work? And to be more specific, Aristotle thought that a living organism's distinctive mode of life, its way of thriving and flourishing, which is proper to it, is determined by the structure of its soul, or the structure of its being. He argued that certain capacities are hierarchically arranged so that one set of capacities will be there in order to maintain another set of capacities, and so on. So when Aristotle looks at what mode of life could be the human function, Aristotle is going to look at, first, what capacities can we exercise, and secondly, whether those capacities might be for the sake of some other thing. We begin with the mode of life, which Aristotle calls the life of growth and nutrition. The part of the soul which is responsible for growth and nutrition is what Aristotle calls the threpticon. The threpticon, or the nutritive part of the soul. The threpticon is the part or the aspect of an organism which is responsible for its physiological maintenance, just its continued biological functioning, just living as such, just the bare functions of staying alive. That's what it is to have a threpticon, is to say that you have one of those. If a creature doesn't have anything else, if a creature just is its threpticon, then that is its mode of life. Its whole living purpose is just to keep on keeping on. Aristotle identifies plants as these sorts of creatures. Plants are beings which are just identical to their threpticons. A plant is nothing more than its nutritive activity and its tendency to grow and to be nourished in a certain way. As long as a plant is growing and being nourished in a way that's distinctive to it, then it is achieving its function. Aristotle notes that that sort of life, while proper to plants, is not proper to us. And here we should slow down and mention what's going on. Aristotle says that we are looking for the special function of a human being, and he dismisses the life of nutrition and growth on the grounds that it is shared with plants. This might falsely suggest that Aristotle is thinking this, that whatever human beings do that is unique to human beings must be their function. But it's not so simple as that. After all, there are lots of things that are unique to human beings, like wearing makeup and driving cars, which don't count as our purpose. I mean, even if uniqueness was enough to be our purpose, then we'd have all these different kinds of purposes. That's not what's going on. Instead, Aristotle is saying, well, we have a threpticon like plants, but we're not just plants. We don't share a nature with plants where our threpticon is what we are. Our threpticon, thought Aristotle, works in the service of another part of the soul. The next type of life that Aristotle considers is the life of sense perception. And as we'll see, Aristotle thought that your emotions counted as sense perceptions too. That if you were angry, you were detecting insults out there, in the same way that when you're using your eyes to see, you're detecting light that's out there. But not to digress, there's part of your soul called the orecticon. It comes from the Greek orexis, which means desire, but the orecticon is the part of an organism, or the aspect of an organism, which is responsible for detecting things out there in the world and responding to them in action. And Aristotle notes that animals have this. Animals have a threpticon, they've got a metabolism and a physiology to keep them alive, and they've also got an orecticon. Animals have this ability to perceive outside themselves and to act on those perceptions. But this second mode of life, the life of sense perception, is the activation of the orecticon's virtues. Furthermore, and this is important, for Aristotle, although the threpticon and the orecticon function together to support an entire being, one of them is for the sake of the other. The threpticon exists in order to sustain the orecticon. The orecticon does not exist in order to sustain the threpticon. He thought that, yes, the orecticon helps to sustain the threpticon, but that's not what it's there to do. As opposed to the threpticon, where, most definitely, the thing it's there to do is to power the orecticon. All that metabolic stuff, all that nutritive, all those nutritive capacities, what they're supposed to do is to power sense perception. So the threpticon, according to Aristotle, exists for the sake of the orecticon. So the question is then, are we like animals in this sense? Is our purpose properly achieved by moving about our environment and detecting things and responding to them in action? You know, like hunting and picking fruit and eating it and finding places to sleep. And is that our life? Is our life a life of animal sensory perception? And Aristotle, again, dismisses this, but not because such a life is shared with animals. It's instead that there's another part or two parts of our soul, which the orecticon is for. Aristotle notes that there's also a part of the soul, a part of us as organisms, which involves asking why or using reason. He notes that there are two parts that use reason. One of them is the logisticon, and the other one is the epistemonicon. The logisticon is the part that Aristotle describes as obeying reason. It is the part which can interpret a theoretical conclusion and apply it to the real world. It's the practically reasoning part of the soul. The epistemonicon is the part that contemplates theoretical things. It does theoretical reasoning, it does calculations, it draws certain conclusions from certain assumptions, and then it's up to the logisticon to apply those assumptions to whatever the orecticon hands it in the way of vision. The logisticon and the epistemonicon are the practical reasoning and the theoretical reasoning parts of the soul. So according to Aristotle, it's like this. We have a threpticon. We have a nutritive capacity. Is exercising that capacity, is that our purpose? No, because there's other capacities that nutritive capacity powers. The next most basic one is our capacity to perceive and respond to our environment the way that animals do. Perhaps living by activating that is going to be our purpose. No, says Aristotle, because just as with the threpticon, the orecticon seems to exist in order to power some other capacities. In particular, there is the logisticon, a part of us which consists in making judgments about what is good and bad within the field of what we perceive. The orecticon hands us a bunch of perceptions, and then the logisticon, well, strategizes about them. So maybe just exercising the logisticon, maybe that's what our purpose is to strategize in action. No, said Aristotle. For just as before, there's another set of capacities which the logisticon seems to sustain and even be dependent on, namely, theoretical reasoning itself. The logisticon, after all, takes its conclusions from what is ultimately calculated at a theoretical level. The theoretical part of the soul, the epistemonicon, is the part that says, according to my calculations, bird meat is good to eat, and we should find some bird meat. And then the orecticon shows us a picture of what's all around, and the logisticon says, there, that's bird meat! And we go over and we eat it, and that nourishes the whole system. So, at the end of the day, Aristotle thinks that the human purpose lies in the activation of a certain sort of capacity, a theoretical capacity. And so, we get the famous conclusion about what the human purpose is. We have found, then, that the human function is activity of the soul in accord with reason or requiring reason. And that's the conclusion that Aristotle maintains, defends, and explains all throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, is that what happiness is, what the human purpose is, what eudaimonia is exercising your theoretical reason in a certain way. Wait, really? That's what happiness is theorizing in a certain way? Yes! And we're going to see how that is as we move on. But before we press on through the Nicomachean Ethics, it's worth talking for a bit about what Aristotle means when he says inactivity of the soul in accordance with reason. What does activity mean? It's actually a highly technical term, and we'll understand Aristotle a lot better if we look at that. So, we're off to Metaphysics Theta. See you next time.